Joining us today is former senior legal counsel at the House of Commons. He is a professor of law at the University of Ottawa. He writes a blog on the law of Parliament and has just recently published a book called Canada's Parliament, a Primer. I know I'm missing a lot, so we'll let him introduce himself. But joining us today is Steve Chaplin to discuss the election of the Speaker, which is expected to be held tomorrow after the shocking and historic resignation of Liberal Speaker Anthony Rota following the controversy where he accidentally recognized and invited a Ukrainian Canadian who served in a Nazi unit in the House of Commons. Thank you for making the time, and I know you're a very busy man, so would you care to tell our viewers a bit about yourself before we kick things off?
Well, yes, you described. I was senior legal counsel at the House of Commons for 12 years, in which time I advised the House, the Speaker, on all sorts of matters of questions of law. And since quasi-retiring, I suppose, in 2017, I've been teaching part-time constitutional law at the University of Ottawa, writing and blogging, and obviously dealing with various media inquiries on matters of parliamentary interest.
Okay. So could you brief our viewers on how the proceedings will go for tomorrow for the election of the Speaker?
Well, actually, I have to start a little bit before that. I have to actually start with today. And today is important because for the election of speakers, individuals are not nominated for the position. Under the standing orders, which are the rules of the House, all members of Parliament who are not cabinet ministers or party leaders in the House are eligible to be elected Speaker. So they must advise the clerk of the House of Commons by 6 o'clock tonight whether or not they do not want to be on the list. In other words, they withdraw from the list. So in about an hour or so, this is it being just after 5 o'clock. Obviously, anyone who has not withdrawn will be on the list of potential Speaker candidates. Tomorrow, the interim Speaker, Mr. Plamondon, will preside over the election of a new Speaker. Those whose names remain on the list will be given a short period of time, 5-10 minutes, depending on how many candidates they are, to basically state why they want to hold the position. Then there will be a period of time, probably about a half an hour or so, for MPs to consider how they wish to vote. And then they will vote in a single ranked ballot, that is ranking all of the candidates. For the sake of argument, let's say there are 8 candidates. They will rank them from 1 to 8. Then they will vote by secret ballot. Those ballots will then be counted, and with the bottom person after each round being dropped from further counting, and their votes then attributed to the remaining candidates until a majority is reached. Last time there were 7 candidates. The voting process took about an hour. So I expect the process will probably take about half a day tomorrow.
Okay. And let me get this straight before we move on. Do we know how many ballots it takes in the end after or for the Speaker to be elected, or is all of that private as well?
Well, last time I think they informed people that they were basically counted 6 times. As far as I know, I've not seen the results after each ballot. So, I mean, the clerks will count them, and the members of the House trust them to count them properly. And so there's basically, like I said, it's one ballot, but it's just a question of how many times the ballots get counted or are used until a majority is reached. I should add, though, if there's a tie at the end, because that is possible because of the ranking system, that then the 2 names would then be put to the House, and then the House would vote again by secret ballot between the tied candidates.
Okay. And from what we have heard, there are many candidates willing to step forward to the Speaker's chair, including 4 Liberals. Could we see a similar situation to what happened in the United States with the Speaker election, where multiple ballots could occur if there is vote splitting? Because last year, Jonah went on for days. I don't expect it to go on for days, but there being at least 4 Liberals, could that draw up some controversy and, as some might say, drama in this proceedings? Or is it standard as usual?
Let me put it this way. If there's any vote splitting, we might not even know about it because, like I said, there's a single rank ballot.
Yeah.
And then they are counted. So we don't have the same nominating process, nor do you have public voting process that they have in the United States, in the sense of people standing and voting. And so what would happen here is there may be four candidates from one party. The risk, of course, in that is whether or not you have a strong candidate from one of the opposition parties who garners enough support and perhaps even some second ballot support or second ranking on the ballot, even by government or Liberal members of the House, that would basically cause a majority of ballots, basically on second or third ballots, as people drop off to actually elect a member of the opposition as speaker.
Okay, and you mentioned that there, so I guess, has this happened before? Opposition candidates, like for example, the former deputy speaker from the Conservative Party, does he stand a chance to be elected? Because it's usually typically a member of the current governing party.
It is, but it's not always the case.
Okay.
In Canadian history, there have been some cases where members of the opposition, Peter Milliken was, for example, speaker one for a period of time when in some of the earlier Conservative minority governments. So it is quite possible that it's a well-known person, and sometimes it could be, for example, if you have a very good speaker from a previous House, that people have confidence in that person to continue as speaker, particularly if you go from a majority government to a minority government. The government changes, let's say from Liberal to Conservative, but people know, and you want a very neutral and respected speaker from the last Parliament, it's quite conceivable. And in this case, it is possible that the deputy speaker, who I understand has been doing a very good job over the last few days, or that we've seen in basically helping to bring the challenges that have been created over the last week or so, when he's been chairing proceedings, has been quite good at keeping order in the House. People may see him as being an appropriate a way to basically continue what was in place before. I mean, obviously he had a role as deputy speaker, and people may have that kind of trust in him this time.
Okay, and Elizabeth May is running for the chair. She is a big-time user of virtual parliament. In fact, she can't vote, I heard, in this election because she is unable to be in the House. Now, she's technically an independent, as she's Green Party without official party status. So she seems like a good enough candidate for the job. But could this be a determining factor in the vote, that she is a big-time user of virtual parliament?
I mean, I think it would be difficult for the speaker to not be present in the House physically. I'm not suggesting they can't. Mr. Rota, when he was speaker, there were hybrid parliaments, and there were times when he was not physically in the House. I think it would be difficult now that we have almost more members, or often have more members in the House than for members' allowances and how members spend money. He or she is also basically the center of protocol for the House of Commons. So there are many other roles that the Speaker has, not just presiding in the House, where being present physically would make the job, or the carrying out of the job, considerably easier for the person.
Okay, and how can the processes for allowing people into the House change so we don't have to have this happen ever again? What happened last week?
Well, there's two or three things to consider. One is we obviously want to have the House to be as open as possible for access. The other thing that is important to recognize is that the Speaker was not the only person who invited guests to the House for these kinds of speeches by dignitaries, or major votes, speeches from the throne, those kinds of large events. All members are given a certain number of invitations that they make. So when no one looks around the House, there's a public gallery at one end, but at the other end, it's a full speakers gallery. There are members galleries on either side. So there are many times and many invited guests. So we have to bear in mind that it's not an unusual thing to have many invited guests by all members of the House. The second thing is that it's difficult for anyone other than the individual member, or arguably the speaker themselves, if they had to, make a determination about who can or cannot, or who should or should not be sitting in the galleries. And it's because this House is independent and each member is part of the House. It's up to the House to decide what kind of rules it would want. And so it may be that they put in place some form of vetting process, or perhaps the protocol office or the office of the sergeant at arms to do some basic research. But at the end of the day, I think it would still be up to each individual member to decide whether or not they still want to extend the invitation. And if they choose to recognize somebody through some, the process that allow for the acknowledgement of various visitors to the House, then they would have to take responsibility. What was a bit unusual in this particular case is that the individual in question, who was in fact identified, was also a constituent of the Speaker. So there's a question of inviting constituents, but there's that role that the Speaker had. But the other, of course, is the Speaker is in fact the embodiment of the House itself. So when the Speaker speaks, in fact, that's where the term Speaker comes from. It's not who he or she not choosing who speaks, but speaking on behalf of the House. When he makes a statement or identifies somebody in the role as Speaker, not as Member of Parliament, he's in fact making that assertion for the House. So I think there has to be a bit more care taken in circumstances where the Speaker, because he or she speaks for the entire House, is a bit more aware of what the background of anyone that they are acknowledging, because they often are the person that does acknowledge people. For example, foreign parliamentarians and those kinds of things are often identified by the Speaker, but they're fully informed and they know what is going on. So I suspect that's one process they can put in place, is some form of vetting or some form of informing the Speaker. The other might be for the Speaker to advise the various House leaders of who they are going to identify, because they are speaking on behalf of the House, so that if they get, for the sake of a better term, buy-in from the various House leaders, then of course it would be much more, or people would be much more aware of the Speaker carrying out the role as speaking on behalf of the entire House, because they would have the support of the various House leaders. So putting in place those kinds of processes, I think, would perhaps mitigate against the same kind of thing occurring in the future.
Okay, and I've heard a lot from particularly conservatives that the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, is involved in the vetting procedures and all that stuff. Is that true or not? Is this on Prime Minister Trudeau at all, or is this directly on the Speaker's office?
In fact, it ought not to be put on the Prime Minister, because the House is independent from the government. And, it's not, I don't think it's very wise. In fact, it would be probably against the independence of the House to have individuals relying on the government, or saying that the government should be doing the vetting and should be directing, particularly the Speaker, who is neutral, about what they ought or ought not to do. The government may or may not be a source of information, but it shouldn't be a form of clearinghouse or vetting, because that would be for the government to interfere in the House. And the House's role, and one of its primary roles, is to hold the government to account. So those people who are being held to account ought not be in a position to be directing the House who it should or should not be recognizing as a House, because it's up to the House. The House is composed of members of all parties, both particularly the government and the opposition. So when the House does this, or when the Speaker speaks on behalf of the House, he or she is not speaking on behalf of the government. So I think it's almost improper for the Speaker to rely on, or be have to basically go to the government before they speak or they identify someone in the House. Now, whether or not they say, I want to some information, and therefore, but I will still choose what to do with it, perhaps it could be a source of information, but could be some form of vetting or some taking some responsibility for what the speaker, who is accountable to and responsible to the whole House, both government and opposition, basically being seen to take direction from or taking advice from only the government on any issue, be it on a policy issue, be it on a House procedural issue, or on an issue like this, in fact, would be improper for the speaker. So I'm satisfied that the government probably wasn't advised, and I think one of the things to note is, for example, was the personal and deep response of the government House leader, who is in fact had ancestors of hers or relatives of hers who were victims of the Holocaust. Well, if she's the government House leader and the government had been advised of this and known of this and had responsibility for this, I find it difficult for the government House leader to have would not have been advised, being the connection to the House. So I'm convinced the speaker probably did not contact the government, and I suspect also that he would not contact the government because of the role of being independent. So the responsibility lies with the House, that is, all members of all parties put in place a process it would like to see for its speaker, for the whole House, to avoid these kinds of situations in the future.
So you're saying that the Prime Minister's office has no particular role in vetting those who come to the House of Commons, correct?
That is correct. It's the role of the House. The House is independent of the government. So the government cannot tell the House, it should not be in the House. I mean, one of the things I can say is that often when I was lawyer for the House of Commons, the people we were spending a lot of time pushing back on was in fact the government. And all sorts of things when they wanted to either cut spending or try to force particular employment policies or whatever on the House. Our job was to say, no, it's not up to the government to dictate those kinds of things. It's up to the House to put in place its own processes and take responsibility for itself. And I think, people forget that, there was a civil war in the United Kingdom in the 17th century where the Parliament actually had an army and fought the king. I mean, and so this idea of, an independent Parliament, I mean, it's not quite that dramatic, but historically it tells you, the hard-fought events and challenges that the House had to make to government, and to get the idea of responsible government and accountable government, and the government be accountable to the House, confidence votes and those kinds of things. It all plays into this independence role, and therefore it is up to the House, and it's not up to the government to dictate what is going on. So if you can't dictate, you can't have responsibility. It's up to the House itself to take responsibility for what its speaker said. And I think what happened here, there was in fact a disconnect when the speaker, there was, I won't say forgot, but misplaced or had a misunderstanding that when he speaks for the entire House. And that there was, there perhaps should have been some consultation within the House with all parties, not just the government, before the speaker does these kinds of things.
Okay. And could Prime Minister Trudeau shut Parliament down by proroguing Parliament in order to reset and avoid any further disruption in this situation? Because if the Conservatives are going to continue pointing it to the Prime Minister that it's his fault, even though, as you just pointed out, it's not the job of the PMO, could he, instead, to avoid a major disaster, which has already kind of happened, but to avoid furthering it, could he prorogue Parliament over this?
I'm not sure this is, proroguing Parliament would solve this particular problem because this isn't a matter for the House. The question of confidence at the end of the day was, there's a couple things to point out. Showing no confidence in the speaker, which is effectively what happened in this case, is the House decided we no longer have confidence in you, Mr. Rhoda, to be our speaker. Is not ever considered a vote of confidence in a government. It's a question of confidence in the speaker, but it's not a question of confidence in the government. And that has been over time quite clear that the issue of speakership is in fact one of for the House. And the second thing, and it's quite clear in the standing orders, the selection of a speaker. In other words, if you select a speaker who is not to the government's liking, that too is not a vote of confidence. So the idea is quite clear that this is not a question of confidence in the government. Now, if the government decides it wants to prorogue for whatever reason it wants, it then will have to face the public ultimately for that. I suspect this will pass, and in fact, one of the challenges for the new speaker is to ensure that the House, as recaptures, if I can put it that way, its dignity and respect that people have generally had for the House as its democratic institution.
Okay. Where can people find you and find your work online?
Well, they can find me in my blog. I have a blog that it's not a regular blog, but when these kinds of things occur, they can reach out to me. I'm at lexparl, lexparl.com. I have blogged on this, and when various stories and whatever come up, I do try to post them to my blog site. And if people obviously have questions, they can contact me through that website.
Okay. All right. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right.